Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and today I'm so excited to be talking to the wonderful Emmy-nominated Matt Bomer about his role in Fellow Travelers. And I've heard you describe that when you were taking on this role, that it was one of those things that it was so exciting to be able to take on a role that was so rich. And I know that you read the book that this was based on in like 2 or 3 days immediately before even diving into the rest of it. But that also there was some anxiety that came with taking on a role like this and everything that this story is navigating through. And so, in looking at the elements that felt really daunting and challenging, I was really curious about kind of how you break that down to a granular level to kind of start working through those obstacles one by one.
Oh, that's a big question. Yeah, I mean, it's everything you could hope for as an actor, but then you have to be careful because it's also everything you could hope for as an actor. So it's a profound responsibility to tell the story of someone's life for 4 decades, especially when they're living through incredibly tumultuous times when in an oppressive society and navigating a love relationship for that many years, multiple love relationships, because I think he really loved his wife in a way as well. And then, so, obviously you do the work dramaturgically. Thankfully, I've been with it almost over 4 years now. So I had time in between when we sold it and development and when it was actually coming to fruition to kind of let things marinate and just kind of sit on the back burner. And I always love as an artist when you have that kind of the luxury of time to let things just kind of be, just kind of bounce around in your subconscious and percolate. And I would get all these weird signs like over the course of the years while it was being developed. Like I remember, I mean, this one's really esoteric, but I was at a beach and there was a falconer there with a falcon, and the falcon's job was to keep all the seagulls away from the beach. And I said, "Do you ever work with hawks?" Because I figured there's a reason why the author chose the name hawk. And he said, "Oh yeah, hawks are totally different." And I said, "What are they like?" And he said, "They fly above everything and watch everything. And when they see what they want, they zoom in on it and ambush it." And I was like, that's a huge part of my character in a nutshell right there. So there were all kinds of little just things that kind of came up over the years. And you know, you like you said, you have to kind of break it down to a granular level. I don't think if I hadn't done Maestro right before and watched Carey Mulligan and Bradley Cooper do the same thing over multiple decades with their character, and it's the trickiest thing to make a character age in midlife because it's not like when you're 62 you have a hunch and a cane or a walker. Like you're still really vital and energetic. It's very nuanced what you have to do. So but I think getting to work with them right before I started this really just kind of gave me the last kind of push of confidence I needed to go, okay, this can be done. And then it was just having great writers and a great directors and an amazing scene partner, a ton of amazing scene partners, a whole cast, all of whom I feel like really like upped my game and made me better in every scene we worked on together. So um, all of a sudden you're just in it and you're making it and it's all happening.
And with Hawk as a character, it feels like there's so many elements and aspects where there's this longing and this desire to reconnect with his childlike self because that was stripped away from him in so many ways, from his relationship with his father, but also having to be so guarded and protective of his identity everywhere in his life. And so as you were playing him and discovering him, did you see a lot of elements of, this is like even in his relationship with Tim, it's like it feels like his inner child is trying to come forth, but has been trapped so heavily for so many years.
I had a ritual that I did every single day. I did 96 out of 100 days on this shoot. And every single day I started the day with a ritual. It changed depending on what decade I was, but there was always an aspect of that kind of warm up character ritual. And this sounds really nerdy, but it just is what it is. It helped me. And a huge part of that was connecting to that childlike place of joy and then burying it and then reminding myself of what the stakes were if I ever let that see the light of day. That was how I tried to walk onto set every day with that. At least that portion of it was in every decade. So I'm glad you were able to pick up on that because yeah, that is the heartbreak of the character, is that it's not until he's in his mid 60s in the last scene of the show that he can actually maybe start to live an authentic life where that kid, before all that trauma with his father and the war and all that, that could actually come to light and be a part of his most authentic self.
And it's so non-linear in the way that he tries to have that reconnection and he tries to open up. You see the desire to be vulnerable, but the inability to be vulnerable in him so
Yeah,
much.
yeah.
And he's able to open up in little ways and push the envelope a little bit further, but then it snaps back. But it's never opening up to the same place and snapping back to the same place. And so I was very curious about how you approached looking at scenes and what is that little trajectory that he's constantly going on scene by scene throughout the show.
It depended on what the power dynamics were in the scene and what was being explored in the scene and what the story was trying to tell in that particular scene. Like what were we supposed to learn as an audience in that scene? But oftentimes I found it more productive rather to do that sort of warm up, as I mentioned, but also to really put the focus on Johnny or whoever my scene partner was, because I think one of the things that made Tim so attractive to Hawk is that he was in touch with that vulnerable, childlike part of himself who could believe in God, who could love openly, who wanted to hold hands in public, all the things that Hawk so wanted, he could see in him. So I tried to externalize it in a way to make it something I saw in him but couldn't have in me.
Yeah.
And that played with different gradations depending on what was happening in the scene.
There's also that conversation that the two of them have where Hawk is talking to him about, the lying gets easier and it's not because you want to do it, but it's necessary and you have to do it. And so you get used to it the more you practice it. And so especially going back to playing him over several years, how did that play into it? Because it feels like that influences how guarded is he going to be in different ways in different spaces because he's always practicing that skill almost.
Well, I always approach, look, you always are coming at your character from a subjective point of view. You're the defense attorney of your character. I never allowed myself to look at any choices Hawk made objectively because in my mind, he was just trying to survive. The stakes of the game he was playing were so real and so high. And, an estimated 10,000 people in the government lost their jobs. Lots of people committed suicide because they were publicly outed. They lost their families. They lost their professional ambitions. They lost everything at that time because of the McCarthy administration and this witch hunt that they went on. And so what I love about Hawk is that he is a renegade in his own right. He kind of gave the middle finger to the establishment. He was like, I'm going to find a way to play the game where you're playing checkers and I'm playing chess, and I'm already 4 moves ahead, and I'm going to stay right at a place of success where I'm not making too much noise so nobody looks at me too closely, but enough that I'm going to end up in Italy where I can have my wife and grandkids and kids and all that, and also go, have my little flings on the side. He's got a whole life mapped out for himself. And anything that threatens his safety or well-being and the safety and well-being of anyone he loves, he's going to make some executive decisions that he are not meant to please anybody. They're meant to just survive. So that's how I kind of looked at it through the lens of the character. And I feel like I really feel like in scenes like that, when he's giving counsel to Tim, he's really trying to help him. It's coming from a sincere place and the only way he knows how to survive, because he learned from 16, 17 that if you are vulnerable and if you show them that vulnerability and if you show them your most true self, you will be destroyed. So I think that's something that softens over the course of the 80s. And obviously what happens with his son and the loss of his son and uh, opens up a huge floodgate of vulnerability for him. So that by the time, he's so on his toes and so buttoned up and regimented, and then obviously he's really Bacchanalian in the 70s, but in the 80s, it's the first time he's starting to really listen to other people and hear their points of view. But yeah, I don't think it's until that scene with his daughter at the end that he's really starting to make a real change of trajectory.
Right. And even with what you're talking about there's no space to be able to show any of that vulnerability, and he's learned it time and time again. it feels like that feeds into when he's being brought in for questioning. And there's the two elements to that. The first time where he's brought in and he's being asked to, walk across the room, read this from a book. And then when he comes in for the polygraph test, and his whole demeanor is, I'm not going to let you see a single crack in what I'm presenting to you. And so did what you were just describing in terms of how he has to operate in the world, to protect himself, did that feed into the way that you went into scenes like that?
I mean, I feel like I lived that experience in a way, growing up in semi-rural Texas and playing football. It's when you bifurcate in that way and you compartmentalize in that way, you really can believe that identity that you forge for yourself to survive in such a way that you can convince yourself. And so I'm not saying I'm like thankful for the way I had to survive high school, but it really, and obviously I'm not comparing it to being in the government in the 50s during the Lavender Scare, but the stakes were felt very real for me. They felt life and death for me when I was in high school. And so it was something that I was able to kind of translate over to the character. And there's a coolness on the surface, but those waters go very, very, very deep. But I think in the polygraph test and scenes like that, he's really bifurcated in such a way that he's got the character down. He knows exactly what to say. He's not going to make any slip ups that you see scenes with guys who do slip up and you realize Huck's not going to fall into any of those traps. He survived the military. He survived his father. He knows exactly how to play the game. He could have been a Philadelphia Highline guy if he wanted to. He could have had that life. But I think this one was ultimately um, the life he chose. He was able to kind of try to have his cake and eat it too, in a way.
Did you find yourself when you were filming that polygraph scene, because the camera is so
Or so
focused
he
on
thought, I
you?
should say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That like the camera is so focused on you in that polygraph scene, and there's that real intention of, I need to slow my breathing down, I need to slow my heart rate down. And so did you find that you were kind of sitting there just creating that physical space that he needs to be able to navigate for himself when you're shooting that?
Oh yeah. I don't know that I left that set very much. The only time I ever left that set in that scene, and a lot of the scenes, but in that scene was when they had to get the camera to a certain place where I would have been in the way or whatever. But yeah, I was fortunate enough that I'd had the script at that point long enough that I kind of knew what he was trying to the physical place he was trying to put himself in. And um, then you nuance it a little bit when depending on how wide the shot is and all of that. But so much of it lived like right here. It was you really just had to think, really.
And I also wanted to ask you about the way in which you and Jonathan Bailey were working together on scenes, because I loved hearing you describe that you really didn't want to over rehearse and kind of overwork the material before you went into a lot of scenes, because you wanted to be able to bring that emotional response to things for the first time. Was that something that the two of you ever talked about, or did you just naturally find that very early on in filming together?
I think we just naturally found it. He's just such a great scene partner to have. I think there's something about that way of working that brings something so immediate to the table where things are really happening for the first time on camera. Where if you over rehearse it, you can try to just play at one thing that you found or chase a perfect take. And again, I was so lucky to have worked with Bradley right before this because we would I mean, we never did more than like two or three takes on Maestro. Sometimes some of the stuff I did in that movie is one take. And he would like go this way on one take and then that way on one take. And so I was coming from this place where I felt like I had the freedom to just try anything when the cameras were rolling. And more importantly, when you have a great actor like Johnny who's just there, he's throwing new things at you. So you're really just reacting to the things he's throwing at you. And there's a way someone could have played Tim that made him more reticent. And I love how much, for lack of a better word, like chutzpah Johnny brought to the character because it gave me so much to respond to. So whether it was a regular scene or even the intimacy scenes, just the way we had established that we worked together was just all about finding it while the cameras were rolling.
I love that description of it. And I think there's also so much in terms of your performance in this show that is the nonverbal dialogue and communication, because there's so many conversations that literally can't be had out loud for your character, for John's character, and for all of them. And so how did that change the way that you were going into certain moments and certain scenes, knowing, well, usually this would be on the page, but there's so much in terms of things that they just never say out loud.
The more I do this, I mean, I don't know how long I've been doing it at this point, but the more I do it, the more I'm interested in what's not said. I look a great script with great words is a great script with great words. We'd be nothing without it. To me, the writing is everything. But I'm so as an actor, I'm and watching people in my life and having studied them for a while now, like I'm just so much more interested in behavior and what people don't say or what they're doing when they're not saying anything, whether they're waiting to speak and not really listening, or whether they're thinking about, you know, someone who's supposed to be calling them in an hour, whatever it is. Like all those things are really interesting to me. You know, the tricky thing about that is you have to have, and I hate to keep going back to Maestro, but like there's that scene where I Bradley introduces me to Carrie's character, and then he just left the camera on me for like 15 seconds after they walk away. And most directors don't do that. We live in such a kinetic, hyperkinetic social media editing age that like people will just snip you out. But I was so thankful both on that project and on Fellow Travelers that in everybody's performance, not just mine, the editors had no problem showing people not talking and just behaving and just listening. I think that's, I don't know, the more I do this, the more that's almost more interesting than the dialogue at times.
You're right there, because there's so many scenes between the two of you where it's just kind of sitting there in the moment and allowing the moment to sit and breathe, which must have
Yeah.
really changed the sense of pacing and scenes that you were able to do as well, I imagine.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, it's times like that when you're just lucky if you have a great scene partner. Because sometimes it's the seventh scene you've done that day or something, you know, and they make a choice that's really great that it changes the whole rhythm of the scene. And you go, oh, yeah, okay, yes, that's the rhythm. Here, let me play with that, and now see what you do, and then you know, like that's what makes the work exciting to me, I guess.
One of the arcs that I also wanted to ask you about with Hawk as well is the first moment that he sees Tim again, because to his wife's point, Tim has been a presence in their marriage the whole time, even when he wasn't physically in his life. He's
Yeah,
always been there. And so you have to imagine that he's played out scenarios of what it might look like if they ran into each other on the street or just like cross
yeah.
paths again at an event. And so what was the intention that you wanted him to go in with in terms of, especially once he knows, okay, he's putting his affairs in order, this is the end of his life in terms of for Hawk.
Oh, you're
What
talking
are his
about in the
intentions?
80s because he sees him again in the 50s. He sees him again in the
Oh yeah,
60s,
sorry.
70s, and
Yeah,
the
when
60s,
when
and
he
the
sees
80s.
them again towards the end, and he knows that he's putting his affairs in order, and it's been several years since they've seen each other. What did you want Hawk's intentions to be kind of going into that? And did you think that he'd really thought it through, or it was just this instinct of I need to show up?
Well, I would love to say that he just wanted to show up, and he did, obviously. But I think Hawks, at that time, hearing that diagnosis in a friend was a really, really terrible. I still, obviously, but at that time, we didn't have the medications that we have now and things, and so it was a really, you know, obviously you can understand what it would be like for him to hear that about the love of his life. I think what he comes in trying to do, and it was one of the first scenes we filmed in that older age makeup. So it was so intense. I remember that day like yesterday. And obviously you built up the whole backstory. I think Hawk goes into it thinking he can fix it. He thinks he can fix it. And I don't mean to stereotype, like a lot of us men think we can fix things at time. Like, oh, if I just do this and this, you're going to be okay. And it's like, no, it doesn't dawn on him immediately that it's not that type of situation. And then in order for him to really be of any use, he's going to have to put himself at risk in ways that he wasn't allowing himself to do it in the 3 decades they'd known each other before. It was going to cost him something very personal and dear to him.
And with the fact that you were also touching on the makeup and, you know, kind of those aspects in terms of the aging, but going back to the way that you talked about it earlier, it's not so much about a physical change, it's more of an emotional difference in the character. Because very
Yeah,
oftentimes it's a much bigger time gap and it is about the physicality being something very different. And
yeah.
so what was that approach for you in terms of just finding the nuance of it being a very internal space that he changes and evolves in over those decades?
It was both. I actually worked with a movement coach, Jean-Louis Rodrigue, who's amazing. And we worked through just like 3 or 4 changes through each decade to kind of lean into physically, posture-wise, that were subtle and not, hopefully overdoing anything. And so there was a physical aspect to it. And then emotionally, like I said, it was that trajectory of thinking he could just come in and do have the same MO he kind of had in the 50s, where if I just station you here or put you here or do this, then everything's going to work out okay. And then letting it dawn on him over the course of that time in the 80s that this is the love of his life. And if he is really going to step up for this person, as he has to grant them the last thing they wish for that he can actually help out with. And so it was both a physical and an emotional arc for the character in that scene, in that time period. But yeah, it played out over 8 hours. So, it was like, a little bit of a realization here in episode 1, and then maybe another one in episode 3. And, what the great thing about Ron's writing is that he didn't try to lay it out in any kind of way that was inhuman. It was the way real change happens. Which is at times, especially for stubborn people, slow and arduous and painful and fraught. And I feel like the way he did that for Hawk's character, I mean, he goes through a lot in that time period in the 80s. So he set the table really beautifully.
It also feels like for Hawk as well, there's so many little nuances of things that only come out in him with Tim that he doesn't
Yeah.
show that side to anybody else. And so what were some of the little shifts or little changes or little nuances that you wanted to be a little bit different when it's the two of them together? Because it doesn't matter how much time it's been, there's always something that snaps back with the two of them.
Yeah, I mean, it's the love of your life, right? So you can love other people, and maybe when you found the love of your life, someone who is your soulmate, who you are so compatible with, where everything is easy in a way. Everything, I mean, not that they didn't have their troubles, but in a way, Tim's needs butted up against Hawk's needs in a way, and Hawk's needs butted up against Tim's in a way that allowed them both to grow. And even when they're connecting um, in an intimate scene, it's much more about their identity. And I feel like this is true of oftentimes if you're oppressed by society, there's a stronger likelihood that that's going to bleed into your love life as well. And the way they express themselves sexually is directly reflective of how they respond to their societal conditioning. Hawk wants control, and Tim wants to give it all away. And or I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth. I can just say Hawk wants control, but they're so complementary of each other in a way. It was so therapeutic for both of them to be able to connect that way and to let that change and grow and morph over time. Um, but there's something in that the other relationships, as much as you maybe want them to, can't live up to in the same way. And there are also frustrations about not being able to have that directly, that can bleed into your relationship with your son, can bleed into your relationship with your wife. And so their relationship, even though it was compartmentalized, ultimately had a huge influence on every aspect of Hawk's life.
Right. And with his relationship with his wife as well, with what you were describing about with Tim, that they're so complementary of each other. It actually also feels like that's very true of him and his wife. And you were saying at the beginning that obviously he loves her as well in a very different way.
Yeah.
How did you feel like the relationship changed once he knows, oh, she knows about this relationship and she may not know all the details, but she understands. And then it's just continues to be this thing that's a presence that they're both aware about. Because I think there's a huge power in when he gets that phone call in episode one and he ends up talking, being like, I'm going to travel, I need to go see Tim, that she's like, I understand that you need to go and I understand why you need to go.
I mean, to me, it's a huge power shift. When she finds out for sure, when she gets confirmation, really, because she knows in the 50s, but it's not, he doesn't know that she knows directly. He knows she knows, but it's not spoken about. But once in the 60s, it's spoken about, it's a huge power shift in the relationship because he needs her. He does love her. He doesn't want to hurt her. He loves the life they have together. He loves their daughter. He loves their grandkids. He loves the fact that they can have a family, the fact that they can maneuver socially, that they're going to have this life together in Italy. Like he loves and has expectations about all those things. But now I think she has a lot more say. And he talks about that. He even talks about it with Tim, like, when they're separate after that, like his little dalliances are very brief, very intense. Bye bye. It's kind of back to the way his MO in the 50s before he met Tim. Because the stakes go up. He almost is more concerned about hurting his wife after she knows than he is before she knows.
And even with what you just touched upon about, he doesn't find himself in any other relationship that even parallels that slightly. And I was
But
thinking
he
about this.
loves Lucy. They were childhood
Yeah,
friends, and he's
yeah.
always had kind of a big brother paternal relationship with her. And he loved her father. Her father was like his all-time hero. So and his surrogate father. So it just felt very natural for him to slip into that. I mean, it wasn't without some coaxing for sure. But
No, it's beautiful to watch that way, the way that that plays out in its own way. And um, I was also thinking about the scene where he's going in for the HIV testing and he's going through all the questions in the medical office, because that was such an interesting one to watch in your performance as well, because you're seeing so many details, going back to being asked, oh, have you had regular partners? And he says, not if I can help it. And that again just tells you so much about the emotional space of, I don't, I find it hard to let people in still.
yeah.
And especially because that was filmed in just like one take, we don't cut away from you. What was your journey in filming a scene like that?
I mean, I'll talk about him as a whole, but there is a part of him that really does feel bulletproof in a way. He's gotten away with so many things because of, the fact that he was a white guy who could come across as straight in the 50s. And so there's a part of him that thinks if I can compartmentalize this in a way and only be a top when I have sex and only have, you know, random dalliances where I'm careful or whatever, that I don't have to worry about the things that other people who are out there fighting on the front lines for our rights have to worry about, which that's a very objective point of view. Subjectively, um, I think he's really, like I said, convinced himself that if he obeys by a set of rules that he sets out for himself, he will survive. He will be okay. He will get to that house in Italy that he wants to have with his wife. And getting sick is not part of that plan. And so he's almost willing it away. He can't get into that place of vulnerability. I mean, I wanted there to be flashes of it, particularly in between the questions when he was just thinking about the next answer or whatever it was. I wanted you to see the real fears underneath all that bravado, but not in any spelled out way because he's doing everything in his power to work against that.
I love that answer in terms of those details, and also in terms of talking about that the final episode and some of the moments for Hawk as well. There's him going up to someone and saying, actually, he's not my wife's friend, he's my friend, and coming out to someone that he's known for a long time professionally, being able to kiss him in public on the street.
Yeah.
And it just feels like there's nothing left to lose at this point. And what was the change that you felt was really important for Hawk to go through and for us to see in him, for him to be able to have those moments, because those are the moments that he's wanted for decades but never been able to allow himself to have.
Yeah, I think it's all built up so beautifully by Ron in that time period. And it's Skippy pushing the envelope with him and telling him he's got to help them fight. He's got to talk to these people. He's got to put himself at risk. He's got to be willing to leverage some of the relationships he has with people who are assholes who could give a shit about him or anyone in his community, Hawk or Skippy, and use the influence he has to help him. And it's the love of his life's dying wish. And that he's seen him, go into seizures in front of him. That he sees the stakes of his illness so immediately that it's the one thing he has to get past in himself that he can give to Skippy. It's not only helping him and coming out and having the courage to do that to that guy and stand up to a guy who so disrespected both of them, and also to be able to somehow in an open place express his love and his feelings for Tim. And it's only because Tim pushes him and shows him such grace and such love that he's allowed to, when you're with somebody and they just do something that's so good that you're like, God, that makes me want to be better. That's who Tim was throughout his whole life, but also especially in that moment. And so I was just so grateful that he did at least have one moment when he could show the world that how much he loved this person.
Right. And the other thing that he gives him right at the end is when Skippy tells him, I need you to leave because otherwise I'm going to try to hold on and I don't want to. And that's kind of the final gift that he gives him. And it's such a beautiful thing to give him and so heartbreaking at the same time.
Yeah.
And what was kind of going through your mind in terms of the emotions for Hawk when you filmed a scene like that? Because that is the
Um,
culmination of all of the years together.
I mean, I get upset even just thinking about that scene, but it's just one of those scenes that you kind of like, it's such a rare experience that if you ever get as an actor that you've played these characters for 30 something years, whatever it was, 35, 36, and you've built up all this backstory together and you've lived it all together. And it's that last scene and it's perfectly written and it ends their love story perfectly. And you just have to get out of your own way and just be present with an actor who you've been lucky enough to get to work with on the material. And your character at that point, and what you're supposed to convey in the scene. And so a lot of it was just being there with Johnny, honestly, and Tim, and just not trying to impose anything on that moment or make choices that I was going to do no matter what, but just being available to all that backstory and all the richness in the writing and a great scene partner.
Yeah, it's such an incredible scene between the two of you, and I loved the complexity that you brought into this performance and this role so much. So thank you so much for sharing all this. I appreciate it so much, Matt.
Thank you. It was the honor of a lifetime, honestly, to get to play a role like this. And I'm honestly more than anything, I'm just so grateful that we got to make a project like this in the world we live in. It's something that might not have happened 10 years ago. And, you know, if anything, we all know how fragile our democracy is. So I'm hoping that we get to make more of these and other people get the chance to make more of them. And I'm just so thankful that Showtime got behind us and Fremantle did, and we got to make this story.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more because I think it's a project that really truly speaks to the importance of storytelling and the way that it can change lives. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. You had amazing questions, and I really, really appreciate talking to you.